Okay, thank you again. Welcome back from break. Are there any more brownies out there? Okay, good. Okay, good. All right. We're very happy to welcome back Dr. Linda Chalker-Scott to present again for us and to talk today about mulch. And I've gotten so many questions about mulch in the last week, and I'm like, just put a pin in it and I'll tell you everything I know after today. So thank you so much. It's a really important topic for all of us, and we're happy to have you. And you've got the handouts, right? Okay.
Well, I'm taking a cue from John and I'm using the lapel. I'm not as disciplined as he is, and there's no way I'll traverse this room well. So I'll traverse the stage, so that I can not just stand up at the podium. And there is a handout for this talk as well. Marisa is getting that handed out to you. It's got, the notes as well as the websites. So hopefully that will be useful to you. All right. So going on with the whole mechanism to give trees a fighting chance. This is kind of the end of what you would do in terms of selecting plants, preparing your site, preparing roots and installation, and that's the mulching. And as I said, the last slide that I gave yesterday said, water and mulch, the two miracle products you need for healthy trees. So we're going to talk about mulch a lot. So what we'll start with is looking at good and bad choices of mulch. And granted, I'm going to be inserting my own opinion very strongly on this, but it is coming from science. It is coming from my own research as well as other people's research. And I'll explain why there's a lot of choices I consider to be unacceptable as mulches, and then why other mulches are better choices. I have an acronym for you because we love acronyms, and that's POW. And I'll let you think about that for a second before we get into it. I'm going to talk about cardboard mulch a lot because I don't know about here, but cardboard mulch is really, really popular where I live. And there are some serious problems with cardboard. We're talking about my research, other people's research on wood chips and this is arborist wood chips as ideal landscape mulches. And then hopefully we'll have time for questions. But again, if we don't have time, or I'm too short on time to answer everyone's questions, I'm out in the lobby, all day. Please come and talk. I'll be happy to answer anything from today or from yesterday. So why do we mulch? Well, there's a lot of good reasons, and there's a lot of mulch choices. We want to reduce soil compaction. In urban environments, that's really important. As John pointed out, his last talk, compaction is one of the main reasons that trees die. We want to protect the soil environment, not just for roots, but for the beneficial microbes that live there as well, and the other critters, the earthworms, the moles, other animals that live within the soil environment. We want to reduce weeds. Last thing we need is competition for water, especially in a dry environment. So we want as few weeds as possible. And mulch can be really beautiful. It can be a part of a really stunning landscape. And I invite you to think about that, especially because since I know in a dry environment, you tend to use a lot of inorganic mulches, stones, flagstone, whatever. You can do some fantastic things with inorganic mulches. So acceptable mulches, living mulches. In an ag system, this would be cover crops or a home vegetable garden. In a landscape, it might be ground covers. Inorganic, you have all kinds of choices. There's beach rock, there's brick, concrete rubble, decomposed granite, lava stone, stone pavers, tumbled glass, all kinds of things you can use. These don't break down, they're inorganic. And then there's the coarse organic mulches, things like bark. And I'll explain why I have that is a limited use. Leaves, nutshells, also limited, pine needles, straw, and wood chips. So there's lots of things to choose from that are acceptable in terms of their impact on soil health and plant health. Here's some neat things that you can do with living mulch and combined with inorganic mulch. So that driveway down there, which I thought was just gorgeous, is actually in Dallas. And so used paving stone for, where the vehicular traffic would go, and intersperse that with all kinds of ground covers that don't require mowing. So you can have both those things, and these are pretty drought tolerant ground covers as well. So you can use both of those things where you have to have heavy traffic or foot traffic. For foot traffic and no vehicular traffic, you can have paving stones and some other types of ground covers. And you can have ground covers that are quite drought tolerant and don't require a lot of extra water. That is the one drawback to living mulches, is that because they're living, they're going to require water. So they will have a little bit of competition with the rest of your plants. But if water's not an issue, why not use it? So let's look at inorganic mulches. And here's another great example. So you can have paving stones and you can have, decorative stones set on edge to just create these artistic expressions in landscapes. And I've just been really impressed with so many gardens I've seen where they've done this and really made a focal point out of these inorganic materials. If you're in a dry environment, stone mulches are a perfect mulch to use. Water is usually an issue, and so you don't tend to have a whole lot of weeds. However, in areas where you do have irrigation, or if you're in a not dry environment, they will become weedy over time. So for instance, in this picture, you can see that along the edge where there's a sidewalk, water is going to run off the sidewalk. Right along the edge there, weed seeds get that water and they'll start to grow. And if you're in a wetter environment that gets lots of rainfall, like in Seattle, at least part of the year, they can become really weedy. And this is concrete rubble, very difficult to weed through. And it gets really bad. Then what do? Now you're really stuck. And horsetail laughs at herbicides. There's just no real way to control them. And now you've got this weedy mess. So if you don't have water as something that's going to be a limiting factor, be really cautious how you use inorganic mulches, unless you can do examples where you can just really pack stuff really closely together, not leaving a lot of room for weed seeds. Keep in mind, and this is important, that inorganic mulches do not provide a key need for mycorrhizae. Mycorrhizae require a decomposing woody material. So trees can survive without woody mulches, but they won't thrive. And maybe that's okay. But one of the reasons I mention this, and I'm mentioning it now, is don't be fooled into thinking that buying mycorrhizal supplements is going to help. They don't, because they not only need their host, the plant roots, they also need that source of woody material, because mycorrhizae are not only mutualistic with tree roots, they're also decomposers. And so they get up into that decomposing woody material, and that's where they extract a lot of their nutrients. Okay, so unacceptable mulches. Synthetics, keep them out of your landscape. This includes any sort of fabric. It includes plastic and it includes rubber. All these things, they're not permanent. They do break down and they put toxins into the soil environment. We don't need to do that. There just is really no good use for them. They're not permanent weed control. I don't care what the packaging says. There's no such thing as permanent weed control. We should know that. Otherwise, we wouldn't have weeds anymore. It can damage soil and plant health. Sheet mulches, like fabrics and plastic, create what I call the POW conditions. And that stands, that stands for poor oxygen and water. So if you have a sheet mulch, it's going to restrict oxygen movement into the soil and restrict water movement into the soil by various amounts, depending on how permeable that sheet mulch is. But all of them are going to restrict both oxygen and water. That's not a good thing. So when we're thinking about the soil environment, it's not just the plant roots, it's the microbes, the beneficial ones. Keep in mind the pathogens don't really care. They do well in unoxygenated conditions, and all the critters that live in the soil as well. Rubber mulches not only are flammable, they're the most flammable of any mulch you can choose. They're also toxic. And I actually have a fact sheet on that, a free downloadable fact sheet on rubber mulches. And that includes also crumb rubber, which is used in artificial turf. So those are two products I would never recommend for landscapes. Then there's the organic sheet mulches, okay? And they will create POW conditions. They will reduce water and oxygen movement from the atmosphere into the soil. Sheet mulches, when they dry out, become hydrophobic. Water runs off of them, takes a while for them to hydrate again, and they can serve as habitat for pests. One of the concerns I always hear from people when I recommend using wood chip mulches, and this is not bark, wood chips, is that they will trap termites. Termites don't like wood chips. As John talked about, trees make a lot of defensive chemicals. A lot of those defensive chemicals are in the wood. Termites don't like to eat wood. They like to eat cardboard. So when you look at research where they've looked at termite behavior and they're trying to assess how many termites are in an area, they use bait traps, and bait traps are cardboard because termites love eating cardboard. If they're forced to eat wood, they tend to have shorter lifespans and not reproduce very well. So termites will not be attracted to wood chip mulches. A lot of people think that rodents can tunnel under wood chips. Well, they can't, because wood chips, they're coarse material, and if you try to tunnel through it, it's going to collapse, right? Sheet mulches make a perfect ceiling for tunnels. They don't collapse, and you will get rodents tunneling underneath sheet mulches. So even though these are organic in terms of they're not synthetic chemicals that are used to make them, they're still not very good choices. And the thing about sheet mulch is that in terms of landscape health and tree health, there's no supporting science to suggest that they're better than some other mulch choice. They're just not. And we can tell just by what happens in some research that I'll show you. It does not control weeds permanently, even though the packaging says it does. And you might remember yesterday I mentioned that other than pesticides and fertilizers, there's no regulation on garden products. They can say whatever they want on the packaging. There's nobody you can go complain to because it's not covered by something like the equivalent of the FDA. There's just nothing for you to do. Pests, as I mentioned, can tunnel under sheet mulches. The POW conditions are a problem because you're getting poor oxygen and water movement into the soil, injuring soil organisms and roots. This includes the synthetics as well. And the organic mulches, burlap, cardboard, newspaper, those types of things, even though they're organic and people think that they're doing a good thing by recycling materials and it's natural and putting it back in the environment, they cause problems because they're not conducive to gas movement or to water movement. So I'm going to go through kind of almost a laundry list of some of these things, pointing out the problems and encouraging you not to choose these types of mulches. Artificial turf. And this was just kind of a stunning landscape. I wasn't quite sure what was going on as I approached it, but as I got closer, I saw that there was a whole patch of it that was artificial turf rather than turf grass. And as you can see, looking at it from left to right, getting closer and closer, it doesn't keep weeds out. And it just looks very strange. It doesn't look like grass. And I'm not, as I said, not quite sure why this was done, but it's just not a good choice. Has crumb rubber. Crumb rubber is a problem. I did, as I said, this fact sheet that talks about rubber mulches, which I'm not going into details on other than say that I never would choose them. Keep in mind that rubber mulches are made out of tires, recycled tires. Dumped tires, the EPA considers that to be a pollution problem. And as my husband points out, and sometimes he has some good points, that the EPA considers dumped tires to be a pollutant. So why are rubber mulches not pollutants? And you don't know, because again, they're not regulated. So it's just one of those things. It seems like it's a good environmental choice because you're reusing something. Lots of other ways you can use rubber over again. It's used to, patch asphalt, lots of other types of things. So rubber can be reused from tires, but you shouldn't be putting it onto your soil. Here's an example of how burlap gets used. And of all the different types of sheet mulches, burlap's probably the least problematic because it's the most loosely woven, but it's still, something that is going to restrict some movement of water and oxygen. So this gets used a lot in restoration, at least in Washington. So when they're trying to put in native plants and take out weeds and things like that, they will use burlap as part of that mulch layer. So what they do is they put the bags down on the bottom, and then they put wood chips on top. And it's just kind of, and then they've, so they cover the whole thing with wood chips. So that's just kind of the way that they lay it out. And I've never been able to understand why, because obviously with a loose weave, it's not going to be restricting weeds. I could see doing it the other way around. So for instance, on that hillside there, as you can see, if that happened to have wood chips there and you were worried about them sloughing off before they get incorporated into the landscape, you can actually use burlap or jute cloth or core, or any of those things, kind of tack down and keep the mulch in place. as it gets infiltrated by roots and mycorrhizae, it's going to stay in place. But initially you can do that. But to put it on the bottom doesn't ever really make much sense. And I've never questioned people why they do the things they do, because they're always volunteers and they don't know. Weed barrier fabric, barrier in quotations, because it doesn't bear, it's not a barrier to weeds at all. Weeds laugh at weed fabric, you know, because what'll happen is the fabric goes down, and for about 30 seconds, it's a good barrier. And then, you know, soil blows in, weeds blow in, rainfall is hitting that fabric before it goes anyplace else. And you're going to have this perfect allotment of nutrients and oxygen and substrate for weeds to grow. So they're going to find them on top of weed fabric all the time. May not be immediately, but they will come. Not a barrier, but the marketing's great. So you can take one of these things and kind of parse it apart and look at all the claims that are made with the weed block fabric. I don't know how well you can read those, and I can't even see them very well from where I'm standing. But anyway, they think they like permanent weed control, lets oxygen through, doesn't hurt plants. All these claims are absolutely not true. But homeowners see this and they think, what a great idea. So with the product overview there, you can say it says chemical free. Well, this is chemical free, I don't know. And safe to use in organic gardens. And then they tell you it's spun bond polyethylene, and gee, polyethylene is a chemical, so not exactly chemical free. Just a lot of claims, excuse me, a lot of claims, no evidence, no science. Lots of good marketing. Great for ornamental landscapes. Sure it is. And the ugliest landscapes I see is where fabric gets used and then things get thrown on top of it, because even homeowners will admit the fabric's not particularly attractive, and so they cover it up with other things, but the damage is already being done. You're told it's good for tree establishment and maintenance. And you can see with these examples that trees suffer and often die, and the fabric is oftentimes to blame because of its, especially its restriction of water to get into the soil. If you look at the directions for installing fabric, it'll tell you you can staple it, you know, and these people actually staple it to the tree. If you look right there where that weed is, you can see there's a staple. And so they've stapled the fabric to the tree, and then they've, you know, thrown some mulch on top. And it's also planted way too deep, and it was planted poorly. So, you know, all the things we talked about yesterday, and John's stuff, one of the reasons I have to say parenthetically, I don't know if is he still here, John? I thought he did. He has to go back to South Dakota. Anyway, I love being at conferences with him because we say the same thing. We say it completely differently, and he emphasizes different things than I do, but we have the same message. And it's really nice because it makes me feel a lot better because he's been doing this a lot longer than I have. But anyway, all these things are going to lead to failure, and the landscape fabric doesn't help. What happens if your desirable plants are lucky, they can find some kind of break in the fabric, they get their roots over the top where they can find nutrients and water and oxygen, and that's where they grow. And then when the fabric gets ripped off, which eventually it probably will be, then you're yanking out the roots of your desirable plants. So it's just not a good choice. Gets used a lot. It's a quick fix for homeowners, but it's a long-term problem for plants. Plastic mulch, even worse than the fabric, because the fabric at least has pores, but even though it says, you know, oxygen can move through, keep in mind that once it's on, you know, the soil, it's going to have soil particles in those little pockets, and nothing moves through it once the soil is in those particles, in those pores. Plastic has no pores. Plastic is death, and it just shouldn't be used at all. So it can cover the trunk, and it hides all kinds of sins like poor installation. So you can see here, you know, we're pulling the plastic away from the trunk there and seeing the clay and no root flare and all the other problems you have with bad installation. Okay, so now I'm going to get to cardboard. How many of you have seen cardboard used in some sort of a mulch? So it's pretty common here too. Unfortunately, yeah. Homeowners love it, and especially for vegetable gardens and stuff like that. And so they'll use it, and As you can see, when it gets wet, it's really, really wet. When it's dry, it's really, really dry. It doesn't really stop weeds. The bottom picture is interesting because they're using wood chips, and wood chips is a great choice, but they're putting cardboard down first. And it's a really odd practice to me. And so I'll ask people, I say, well, why are you doing that? And the response is always, I'm trying to smother the weeds. And my response is smother a good word to use when you're talking about a living soil system? And no one's really thinking about the soil. They're thinking about the weeds. They don't want to see the weeds, they're going to smother them. And they are smothering things, but the weeds don't care. Weeds are weeds for a reason. And what's happening, though, is that you're restricting the ability of water and oxygen to get into that soil. The chips won't do that as much. Anything that covers the soil will do it to some extent, but wood chips do it the least. This is the culprit, lasagna mulching. How many people have not heard of lasagna mulching? Not very many of you. Okay, so lasagna mulching, it's that emotional appeal to something we all love to eat. And then we're going to apply it to the soil with cardboard and then compost. And you're told you could do as many layers as you want, make a nice big lasagna, and then it's all ready. And it's a no-till approach, which is actually good. We don't like to till the soil because it does a lot of damage, releases carbon dioxide, all kinds of bad things. Even agriculture is getting away from doing, routine tillage. That's the best thing I can say about it. It's a noodles and sauce thing. It's a do-it-yourself. It's a recipe. People love it. They think they're recycling, they're helping the environment, they're helping their plants, they're helping their soil, and nothing could be further from the truth. Cardboard is manufactured to repel water. Amazon wouldn't use it to ship stuff all over the world if it was going to melt in water. So when corrugated cardboard is different than paperboard, it's got the corrugation, you just have to look down the edge and you can see the corrugation. And when they manufacture it, they put chemicals in there to repel water. And we're going to come back to those chemicals in a minute. So because there's no science behind lasagna gardening at all, it's promoted heavily by permaculturists. I decided, well, we're going to produce some science. There needs to be something that we have as a baseline. And nobody had ever done any research for or against sheet mulching in terms of gas movement. So that's what we did. We used a variety of different mulches to find out how easily carbon dioxide could move out of a living soil system and oxygen could move in. So these are the systems. These are called mesocosms. And it's a very simple, lab type of experiment. When you're starting from scratch and there's no research, you have to start with a really simple lab experiment. Excuse me. Where only one variable is there. Sorry for the coughing. And that's whatever is on top of the soil. So the containers are exactly the same amount of soil inside, microbes in the soil for the living part of the soil, and then stuff stuck on top. And some of them don't have stuff on top. Those are the controls. So this is what happens with no mulch. Then some had arborist wood chips. Some of them had plastic mulch. And there was all kinds of replication of this with the different treatments. So we had bare soil. And again, those are controls. But keep in mind, and this is just kind of a warning, that the bare soil in a mesocosm where there's no compacting forces of feet or rainfall or anything else does not exist in nature. So even though bare soil, the control is the best for allowing oxygen to move in and carbon dioxide to move out, it's only because it's not compacted. So it's not really existing in a natural world, but you have to have a standard to measure everything else against. Then we had plastic mulch that was black plastic. We had arborist wood chips, 4 inches, landscape fabric with arborist wood chips on top because a lot of people do that. Cardboard, 1 sheet of cardboard and a sheet of cardboard with arborist chips on top. So we could have chosen a lot of different mulches, but the problem is you have to be realistic when you're doing research. We had 7 treatments. We had 7 replicates. We had 49 of these mesocosms. This is expensive work to do, and we couldn't really expand it way past that. And we just wanted to create a baseline for some really commonly used mulches. So what happened was that these mesocosms were left to their own devices in terms of being left in a lab in a controlled environment where oxygen can go in and out of the mulch. and carbon dioxide can come in or out. And everything was kept moist, but everything was, kept exactly the same other than what was on top of those soils. Then we had different kinds of equipment to measure things like carbon dioxide. So the lichorometer is used to measure carbon dioxide. We have a gas analyzer, and you can see that we would set these things up every once in a while to make measurements of carbon dioxide and oxygen, as well as figuring out temperature and water, data and all this stuff. So we're set up over here collecting some other data, and you can see what happens. We put a top on the mesocosm at this point because we want to have a closed system. At this point, we don't want things coming from the outside environment. We want to see what happens in a closed system. So that was the setup for it. And then what we did was took aliquots of gases out of these mesocosms. So that top one is above the mulch layer. So it's whatever the atmosphere is. The bottom one is actually in the soil. So we have those two aliquots of gases coming out with various amounts of carbon dioxide and oxygen, different areas, and looking at those and the differences, we can measure over time how easily things move through the soil. So it's a pretty easy experiment in terms of what we're measuring. It was complicated mathematically. The article, which you can download and read, is mostly calculus. So not my favorite topic, but it does produce some interesting data. So that's just what we did over a period of several hours. I believe it was every 2 or 3 weeks. It may have been more than that. I can't remember exactly. But what I did with the data that we collected, and this is not in the article, but I use it for educational purposes to show you the differences among these mulches. So first of all, this is looking at carbon dioxide. We also did this for oxygen, and it's a diffusion coefficient. And the nice thing about a diffusion coefficient, it's a constant for a mulch. So the diffusion constant for or coefficient for plastic will always be the same. Doesn't matter what the temperature is or the moisture or anything else, it remains the same. So what you can see on this is we've got the treatments on the bottom, the different materials. We have the coefficients on the y-axis. And the second thing I want you to see about this graph is that y-axis is exponential. So each tick mark is a factor of 10. So it's like pH scale or earthquakes, anything that has a factor of 10 exponential scale. So when we're looking at this as the overall result of carbon dioxide movement anyway, bare soil is the best, has the highest diffusion coefficient because nothing's on top of it. But again, that would never translate to real life conditions. Then arborist wood chips. And it's roughly, around 10 times more restrictive, not quite 10 times, but close, but obviously better than cardboard, which is 10 times worse. Single layer of cardboard, 10 times worse than 4 inches of wood chips. Landscape fabric, 100 times worse than the cardboard. Plastic, over 10 times worse than landscape fabric. So working backwards, if you happen to be using plastic, you can say that plastic is 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000 times worse than 4 inches wood chips. I mean, this is stunning information. And it's the first time anyone had ever looked at mulches and their effect on oxygen and carbon dioxide movement. So it's a measure, it's a beginning to look at the question. And this again goes to the fact that there's no research on sheet mulches to show they do any good at all. It's all marketing. So this came out in this article here, which is soil and tillage research. All of my co-authors are soil scientists, soil engineers, people that don't do plant work at all. I was a plant person. And so of course it's lots and lots of math, lots of soil stuff. But we did get one sentence in to the abstract as a message to people doing practical work like us that says, among the mulches tested, wood chips are a preferred method of mulching in terms of providing best gas permeability, particularly in landscape conditions. So this is finally the evidence you can use as definitive that this is what's going to happen if you use these other mulches. And for the best oxygenation of soil and continuing on to keep your soil life happy, you need to not use sheet mulches, period. This is the other thing about cardboard. So some of you have heard me talk about mulches before, but you haven't heard this part because this just came out last year, September of 2023. An article came out talking about cardboard and forever chemicals. Who has not heard of forever chemicals by now? So you all know these are things we're trying to avoid because they just don't go away. So this is the article talking about looking at all these environmental contaminants, which include the PFAs, but there's all kinds of other ones too. Looking at recycled materials used for bedding and looking how that's transferred to the eggs and tissues of chickens. So this isn't plant work, but it's relevant to plant management if you're looking at the effect of cardboard on living systems and of soil. So this was alarming, and I will apologize deeply for how tiny this is, but we'll kind of magnify a little bit in a minute. But this is looking at all the contaminant concentrations in different types of bedding. The one that's in green is the one they use as kind of the control. And oddly enough, that control is untreated wood shavings, which more or less is like wood chips, except it's much more finely ground up for chickens. And the control, of course, is going to have the lowest. So that was how they set up their experiments. Now, there are some abbreviations that I'll refer to. One is TEQ, and that's kind of looking at all the different contaminants, and that's a total equivalent quantity for looking at these different contaminants. So they sum up all of these and they get this TEQ. It includes PCBs, which were banned in 1976 in this country, and they're still out there. They are forever chemicals, and they bioaccumulate. All these things will bioaccumulate. There's flame retardants, and there's the PFASs, and these are the perfluoral acetyl substances. And those are the coatings that are used in cardboard to resist water. So this is what's used to make cardboard the material it is that can be used for shipping. Eventually it'll break down, but not until the wood part of it, the recycled wood part of it is able to hydrate and break down. So now I'm going to compare just the recycled material, the shredded cardboard, to the control, the unused, not recycled, but new wood shavings. What I want you to see here is total and the toxic equivalence of the shredded cardboard, 9.84 compared to 0.33 in wood. This was the highest of any of the treatments. That's yes, that's wet weight. Sorry, thank you. So that's how much of this stuff was getting into, as you can read down there, into in the material itself, and then translated into the eggs, the muscle, the skin, and liver of the chickens. So it gets into these living systems, and we eat those things. So this is a bigger picture than just soils. And what scientists are warning us is we really need to reduce our exposure to PFASs and to these other things. And they are there in spades, in recycled cardboard. So this has changed my behavior, because I always recycle my cardboard, through recycling, but sometimes there'd be shreds of it that'd stick into the compost bin because it's brown material. I will never put cardboard in my compost bin again. And I would encourage you never to have your clients or anyone that you know put cardboard on their soil. Because if they're not convinced by the whole thing with oxygen and healthy soil environment, this should be enough to keep people from ever putting cardboard on their soils again. And it is not fear-mongering. This is established science, and it's a scary thing. And we just need to really be aware of this. Even though it's not in the plant literature, it's still relevant to what we do. So we don't want to smother weeds. Smothering doesn't work. Mulching should protect soil life. Maybe not the weeds, but protect soil life. So thinking about weeds, what's the one thing that weeds need that the rest of the soil does not?
Their soil.
Well, yeah, but what do they need to survive and thrive? What do weeds need that things in the soil don't need? Sunlight. So we want to restrict sunlight. We don't want to restrict oxygen or water. So we don't want the POWs. We want something that is going to keep the light away. So sheet mulches are not going to help because they're just restricting oxygen and water. And sure, have enough of them, enough on there, and it's going to restrict sunlight too, but not as well as other methods. So eliminating the sunlight is going to eliminate weeds, or at least reduce them to a manageable level where you can, pull a few here or there, but you'll get 99% of your weeds. Photodormant seeds, weed seeds. These are the little tiny weed seeds, and they're tiny, and they have to have sunlight as they're triggered to germinate. And the reason is they have very few resources stored up in there. And to get the seedling out and into the sunlight, there has to be sunlight available. So if the weed seeds don't get the sunlight and they're small, they will not germinate. Bigger things, and obviously corn and beans aren't weeds, but they have a lot of resources, so they can be buried and they can still start to grow. They're not photodormant, but most of our weeds are photodormant. Perennial weeds that'll die back to the ground in the winter, their crowns need light to start growing again. So we cover up the crowns and prevent it from getting light, and they're not able to grow as well. They'll still grow. The resources will get mobilized. They'll start putting out shoots, but now those shoots have to get through, several inches of wood chips before they reach light. And if they're not well-established perennials, they may not make it. Again, soil organisms don't need the light, so we don't need to worry about effects on them. And what my research has shown, and many other people working on this, is that a deep coarse mulch will restrict the light and have little effect on water and oxygen, and support and emphasize on establishment and survival of trees that have been installed there. So this is, even though I know there's an issue with in drier areas like Albuquerque or any place where most of you are coming from, I think there's ways of having wood chip mulches along with the inorganic stones that get used, because they really are useful in terms of getting the slow nutrient feed, and as a source of beneficial microbes, all the good things that wood does. So I'll talk about that a little bit too, but a deep coarse mulch is going to be the best in terms of restricting light. So what I suggest to people that are trying to get rid of lawns, get rid of weeds so they can put a different type of landscape in, is not use cardboard, not use landscape fabric, but actually use plant physiology against the weeds. And what our research has shown is that perennial weeds will mobilize their resources that are in their root system somewhere around February and March. And so they're taking all that starch and they're turning into sugars and they're sending it back up to start shoot growth. If you can then remove shoots at that time, so by mowing or scalping, you have now reduced the ability of the plant to recover, because it's already mobilized its resources. It has very few resources left. So a good time for some of this would be in early spring, is to take off the shoots as they're coming up, and maybe not in February, but March or April, when you're starting to see growth, then you take it out. Or conversely, you do it when the weeds are dormant. And you don't have a whole lot of growth. And in my part of the country, our lawns go dormant in the summer because we have droughty conditions for about 3 months. It's hot and dry for 3 months. And so you can scalp it, and then you can put wood chips on top. And I recommend starting with 12 inches. This is not bark. This is arborist wood chips. 12 inches sounds like a lot, but if you use wood chips fresh off the truck, they'll be about 6 inches in about a month, because they're going to initially have a lot of decomposition, and all that decomposition, good stuff from the bacteria is going to go right into your soil. So you're giving your soil a nice boost of nutrients. And then you're just going to let it cook. Whoops, keep doing that. And so that's a great way of getting rid of the weeds without injuring the soil, and in fact, enhancing the soil, because this is doing all the things that an ideal mulch does. Protects the soil, moderates temperature, moderates water, does all those great things, and keeps the weeds out. So this is a good way to start, and you may not be able to continue to use wood chips, given the landscape you're working in, but it's a good way to get a landscape to be ready for planting, as opposed to using these other sheet mulches to get rid of the weeds. I mentioned wood chips, but there are other materials. You don't want to use wood shavings like they used in the chicken study, because those are too fine and they kind of all become matted, and you can't get them deep enough. so that they keep the light out without also reducing water and gas movement through them because they are so finely textured. So you can't do deep mulching because you get that low oxygen movement. And if it's too thin, especially with compost, weeds love compost. And so they'll just grow like weeds because that's a nice nutrient source. So compost is not a great mulch by itself. You can use it as an initial layer, especially if you don't have much organic matter in your soil and you need to up the organic. Thin layer compost, wood chips on top. There's a few other ones that I mentioned before, the bark and the nutshells. These are hydrophobic mulches. And unfortunately, and kudos to the marketing again, whoever came up with the term beauty bark, boy, they made themselves a lot of money because, you know, bark is just a waste material from the timber industry. And, you know, to our credit, we try to figure out ways to reuse these wastes. And so this stuff, you know, gets stripped off the trees, and the function of bark is to protect the tree, right? And it acts kind of like the wax on your car. But this is keeping water inside the tree and it can't get out, as opposed to the wax in your car, which keeps the water from getting into the metal. But it's a protective layer. And with thick, corky mulches, bark, they're very waxy. So they have suberin and different types of waxes to prevent water from moving out. They've got a lot of defensive chemicals. And the problem is if you use a mulch that's made only out of bark, it's a hydrophobic mulch because bark is naturally hydrophobic. So especially with some barks, for instance, you know, we've got a lot of Douglas fir, it will make mulch layers that, because of all that gooey wax, which heats up in the summer, will just, I mean, you can pick up huge sheets of the stuff where it's all kind of just fused together, and underneath it's bone dry because water won't move through it. So it's kind of a desert underneath these mulches. The other bad thing about bark is because it is hydrophobic, it never really gets integrated into the landscape, doesn't become part of the mycorrhizae and the roots and the soil. It blows off, it washes off, it doesn't stay in place, unlike wood chips, which will stay in place. Nutshells and pine needles, they also absorb little water. But I had mentioned in that one slide that there's limited use, and I think we can use these in limited areas. So for instance, if you need to have a pathway or something that you don't want to have inorganic material, you can use nutshells, you can use bark, that can be a pathway. It will be effective in terms of, especially if it's relatively thick, in terms of it moderating soil temperatures and compaction, all that kind of good stuff. And it's not really right next to plants. I mean, obviously there's going to be some roots under there, but it's not going to significantly affect nearby plants because it's just a limited use. So I think we can use those materials, but we just need to not use them overall as a landscape mulch because they don't have the ability to absorb water. So coarse wood chip mulches, the great things they can do, they can provide nutrients and organic material in a sustainable way. So you remember yesterday I was talking about how different sites can be, depending on what naturally is there in terms of additions to organic matter and subtractions, and what you're left over with is what's naturally sustainable. So this will be part of that natural sustaining because it's coming from the top, it's leaching through, and it's a slow feed. So you can kind of consider these mulches to be slow food as opposed to fast food, which would be fertilizers. So you're getting a slow feed through the system. You're protecting and enhancing the soil ecosystem, and it restricts light at the soil surface. So these are all the things, I mean, it almost ticks off all the boxes that an ideal mulch has. Of course, the one detriment is that they have to replace it, you know, and so you do have to replace these mulches as they get thinner. And so while I kind of recommend, especially if you're trying to restore a landscape and kind of get the soil as being a blank slate, use 12 inches. When you're doing a landscape, try to keep it around 4 to 6 inches. If it gets below 3 to 4 inches, light starts coming through and you'll get weeds. And you can always tell when it's time because you'll see weeds starting to come through. There's enough light. And they're saying, yay, yay, there's this great nutrient source and I'm gonna grow like crazy. So you have to keep it thick enough to keep the light out, but not so thick that it becomes unattractive. It's not harmful to the plants or soil to have it thicker. We've published work, you know, where we've used 12 inches. Anecdotally, I've used 2 feet before, depending on what I'm trying to get rid of. And the vegetation I want to keep, the trees and shrubs that are there, they're not impaired by it at all. So, but I do recommend 12 inches for renewing a landscape, 4 to 6 inches just in general for providing the benefits the mulch brings. So we want to preserve that microbial life, enhance water, and because the mycorrhizae will enhance water and nutrient uptake of the trees and protect the roots from pathogens. So those are two of the huge benefits that mycorrhizae will provide to trees. So this gets back to the question about what do you guys do when you're in a desert environment where stone mulch is commonly used and with good reason, but you've got trees that aren't from here because they're good trees for your environment for whatever reason, but they've evolved in a forest where they naturally have a duff underlayer, which is decomposing wood. So I saw some pictures yesterday of a project that was in Salt Lake City. And one of the things that was not associated with the project just showed kind of a right-of-way area along a road where they had trees and they had a bunch of boulders and stuff. So a lot of inorganic mulch that doesn't have to be replaced. These like 1 or maybe 2-man boulders. And then in between, there's like little patches of wood chip mulch. I thought, well, there's a good idea because we don't have to have the entire soil surface covered with wood chips. If we're, especially in a desert environment where it doesn't make a lot of sense, it might be really hard to get that much. But if you have some little islands of this mulch, which is, you know, the benefit to your tree roots, the tree roots are going to find those and you'll get your mycorrhizal establishment because mycorrhizal spores the wood chips are just rich in these spores as well as other beneficial microbes. So that's maybe a way to look at it is have a mixture, and I'll have to get a picture of that so I can have that next time I give this type of talk, where it shows how you can use the wood chips as well as an inorganic mulch when you're just using kind of islands of the wood chips to provide the benefits. So there are concerns. You'll have people that, you know, will be willing to listen to you about wood chips, but they have a couple concerns. And one is, what about nitrogen immobility? You know, using wood chips, it's a high carbon to nitrogen ratio. Isn't it going to tie up the nitrogen in the soil? Good question. And what about diseased wood that's chipped up and then used as a mulch? So these are the two questions I get a lot. If you've talked to clients or, you know, if you're a master gardener or educating customers or whatever about mulches and nitrogen deficiency or disease, this will help. So the first question, and this is just some of our data, but many people have shown this, so it's not new science, is that when you look at both soil pH and carbon to nitrogen ratios in trials before experiments and then during experiments, you'll see that before the trials, that very top thing, you can see pH is 6.2. And I mentioned pH because some people think that, you know, wood chips will lower pH. So pH is 6.2, a carbon nitrogen is 10.9, which is like ideal. And then you go through all these controls and treatments. So all the pH in that first row, you'll see, well, they're all about the same. They're all 6 point something. And then over the carbon nitrogen, it varies anywhere from, I think the very lowest is 10.8 up to 13. And you run the statistics on this, there's no differences. You know, there's noise in the system, but statistically there's no difference. And this is measured 1 centimeter below the interface. And that's where, you know, you're gonna have fine roots and everything else. So at the soil surface where the mulch actually touches the soil, sure, you're gonna have a nitrogen deficiency like crazy because there's microbes right there in the wood chips that are going to be using that surface nitrogen. But a centimeter below, there's no difference. So it's just not a concern in reality to impairing plants. If you happen to accidentally or on purpose work wood chips into the soil, then you're going to have a problem. So don't ever use wood chips as a soil amendment. I really, really recommend if you're doing stump grinding to not do the stump grinding in the soil. If you have to grind, take it out because it will introduce a huge pocket of nitrogen deficiency into that system. And we can see this. I mean, this is something you can just see by looking at landscapes. You can look at things that have been for restoration or whether they're just public green space where wood chips have been used, and all kinds of things can pop through them, whether they're acorns that have been planted by squirrels or whether they are bulbs planted by humans. And right now, you know, I use wood chips in my entire landscape and all my bulbs are now sending up shoots. and it doesn't impair them. They're easily able to send things up through that coarse wood chip. And it's because there's a nice storage organ under there that's keeping the resources so they can do that. And as I said, if you do work them into the soil, and this is some of our research here, just showing what happens if you incorporate into soil, you can see you'll have very severe deficiencies in nitrogen by doing so. So fungal communities in wood chips, what lives in wood chips? Well, we have a lot of decomposers and that makes sense, that's where they would be. But they're not pathogens. They are decomposers. They're using dead material. They're not infecting live material. And as I mentioned, many mycorrhizae, or all mycorrhizae possibly, are also decomposers. So if you have a healthy soil, by healthy I mean it's well oxygenated, doesn't, and it's not stagnant, doesn't have a lot of standing water, doesn't smell bad, then your beneficial and harmless fungi are going to outcompete pathogens for space on the plant roots. So that's one of the things that, as I mentioned before, with mycorrhizae, they make a sheath around the plant roots, as do beneficial microbes. And I mean, it's kind of like you with your skin, and you know this, that you have all kinds of things that live on your skin, and that if your skin gets broken, then things, then you get pathogens that can get in there. But your skin is colonized by a lot of beneficial things, and that helps keep you healthy. Your intestines and your whole digestive system colonized by beneficial microbes. And you probably know this if you've ever had to take antibiotics. It really screws up your internal system because now there's other things that get in there to make you feel kind of sick. And sometimes you can get really sick depending on what gets into your system. So this is the same thing that microbes will do for plant roots. If you have, excuse me, if you have a healthy system, even if you're using diseased wood, it will not infect healthy plant roots. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Part of the reason is that a lot of these pathogens require fairly large pieces of wood to survive as a colony. So I mean like a diseased branch, but when you're talking about wood chips, the spores might be there, but you don't have an actively growing colony. And the second thing is that you've got a mulch layer up here and your healthy roots are down here, and there's no way that the pathogens are going to somehow get down to the roots, especially in a system that's already well oxygenated, because as I mentioned, beneficial microbes do really well under high oxygen conditions, and pathogens do well under low oxygen conditions. So when the research has been done with Phytophthora, Armillaria, Thyronectria, there's several diseases that have been looked at, mostly root rots, and they just don't affect plants in the landscape, even if you're using diseased wood. So those are two concerns that really aren't going to be borne out in reality, but people will have those questions. So this is some of the research that I did with a graduate student looking at different types of wood chips. And I just and this is just a real brief thing to show you what happens over time with weeds. And so I love this picture. It just shows all these different plots with different textures of wood chips, different depths. And in the middle of each one, you can see a little hole, and that's where we have our tree planted. And this is how it started. So it looks nice and clean. In 3 months, it looked like this, because this is in very rich valley soil, and there's just a huge weed bank there, weed seed bank. And then a year later, it looked like that. But with the deepest ones, which were 12 inches deep, there were 0 weeds on any of the plots, 0 after 2 years. So what this mulch will do is it'll keep the weeds at bay long enough so tree roots can establish without competition. And then by the time, the mulch is going to break down, this was never touched or weeded or anything, just left to go for 2 years. The trees are now established and they can compete well against the weeds. The weeds will suffer and the trees won't. So this is really useful information when you're making these decisions. So what I suggest is remember to consider root requirements. We know they need water. We know they need nutrients. We forget sometimes they need oxygen. And we forget that they also need microbial partners. So they need all 4 of those things. We have to have soil environments that support that. Choose the appropriate mulch depending on use of the landscape. Use living mulch if you can, if water's not limiting. Inorganic mulch, any place you have foot traffic, car traffic, whatever. And then coarse wood chips around, but not necessarily covering all soil, but around the woody plant so that they have that resource. Some people worry about beneficial insects that are ground nesters. What I suggest is that areas that are underneath shrubs and trees where it's shady and you're not gonna have weeds anyway, leave those areas bare. And those are good places for ground nesting insects. And then you can just have fun. You can, mix and match mulches to you or your client's content. I want to mention, because I hadn't mentioned this yesterday, I just saved it for today, is I've got a lot of peer-reviewed information, not only on this, but on some other sources. So this one has to do just with mulches in general, both a review of landscape mulches and then some kind of fact sheets on how to use arborist wood chips. I have a horticultural myth website, and these are all listed on the back of the notes in terms of the URLs, so you can find those easily. I have publications, some of you have seen these, that are out there on myths, on how plants work, and a DVD series. If you're interested in seeing those, please feel free to look. I don't come here to show my books, but I always bring them just in case people are interested to see them. This is where I store all of my materials that I've published that are peer reviewed. This includes fact sheets, manuals, as well as journal articles. So if you're not familiar with ResearchGate, it's a thing that researchers kind of use as their library to share with other researchers, but anybody can start an account. Doesn't cost anything, and then you can access it and find my papers, John Ball's papers, anyone's papers that you're looking for. We have a blog that we've been doing since 2009 that is a lot of fun, and I'm actually giving a talk tomorrow for the Master Garden. It's called Batshit Crazy. So that's, and you know what I'm going to talk about, you can guess. We have a Facebook page, and actually, if you've met Sylvia, who's been sitting with me with my books and stuff, she single-handedly has managed this page that had over 7 million visits last year. She is an incredible resource. So what we use this for is a clearinghouse for interesting blogs, other types of science-based information, as well as some fun things like cartoons and things. So it's a mix of stuff. And then we have our Garden Professors blog group, which has over 27,000 members now. And this is a science-based group, and it has very strict requirements about what you can talk about, and not in a way to smother speech, but to not talk about do-it-yourself recipes, to not talk about anecdotal stuff, but to present things that are science-based answers to questions that everybody has. And I learn new things from this group every day, because there's interested gardeners and professionals and researchers from all over the world that belong to this. And I think we've got 13 or 14 volunteer administrators that kind of ride herd to make sure that everybody does what they're supposed to. It's a great resource. So if you join it, you do have to answer 3 questions, and it's just to keep the bots out, especially AI now. And we get hilarious answers now through AI, and which make no sense. And we've been making fun of those. But anyway, you have to answer 3 simple questions. You can jump right in, go through the archives, find out some interesting things that people are up to, ask questions. We welcome everybody to do it. What we try to encourage you to do is not tell us that you're looking for information for a client, because then some of our administrators get annoyed that we're used to, so you can make money. But you ask question, anything you want, just for yourself. And that's just fine. So anyway, with that, maybe time for a few questions. And I think that those microphones anymore? Yes, over there. And I'd be happy to answer those. Uh-oh. Oh, thank you.
Okay,
We're probably running a little late, aren't we?
I know there's very little time here, but I do want to talk about volcano mulches.
Okay, excellent question.
Because we have dormant volcanoes in New Mexico. So take it away.
Okay. I do want to mention, though, in terms of volcano mulch gets blamed for a lot of things. So before you decide that volcano mulch is what's killing trees, move the volcano mulch aside and look what's underneath. Because, and this is a whole another story. One of my colleagues has done research. Talked about it yesterday about what volcano mulch will and won't do, and it has not ever been shown to kill trees. So Is there, okay, that's great, good. I didn't want to overstay my welcome up here.
Hi, thank you. I have a question about using mulch from species of trees that may be alleliopathic, and does that affect the growth of specific plants that you're trying to cultivate?
It's a great question, and it actually points out that one of my white papers that I have on my website is no longer accurate. And that's because I did some scholarly research looking at the history of allelopathic research. And as far as I can tell, looking at the literature, you can prove allelopathy works in a petri dish. It does not occur in landscape. So to use anything you want, use black walnut mulch all you want. It's never been shown to have an impact in the landscape conditions as a mulch.
I just want to ask, nobody really talked about leaf litter, leaf fall. Has there been any research on that? And do you encourage people to keep the leaves that fall from the tree on top of the existing mulch?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I love leaf mulch, and we have a bunch of centuries old Gary oaks where I live. I keep all my leaves, I blow them onto landscape beds, I let them sit there all winter, and I put chips on top. So the one thing I would caution you about is if you have, and Gary oak tree, like most oak leaves, they're pretty coarse and rough and three-dimensional, so they don't tend to compact. If you have maple leaves or other things that are really thin that tend to make sheets, they will become anaerobic. It happens in nature too. So I'd mention that only because I would encourage to avoid having really deep layers of soft, broad leaves, because they will restrict oxygen movement in the soil.
I have a question about wood mulch in fire-prone areas.
Okay.
Because I did a tour in a fire-prone area, and the customers were not allowed to use wood mulch.
I know. And this is really unfortunate. And this is where the science has not gotten into the people are making decisions about what you can use as mulches. Bark mulch is extremely flammable. Wood chip mulch is not. It's the least flammable of all the organic mulches, and that's been tested. And that's because bark will not absorb water, and it's full of waxes, which are flammable. Wood chips will absorb water, and when they're part of a landscape, they might smolder, but they're certainly not going to ignite and cause problems. If you have, I mean, the best thing for a fireproof landscape is no mulch, and you might as well have no trees. And that's just unfortunate, because the recommendations being made is not accurate.
The second question is about what mulch do you use when you have dogs?
Well, I guess then you have to have a mixture of things. I still would recommend in that case, you know, you have a mixture of things that you use, and you have ground covers, might be lawn for dogs. And then where you have your beds, I mean, I think that we need to, at least we train our dogs when I was growing up, to stay out of the beds, because that was not a place they were supposed to be. So you have to, I mean, it's what you need for your landscape use. And if you have dogs, obviously you have to provide something for them, and not just have it be solid wood chips. But on the other hand, it doesn't have to be solid lawn either.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
One
more question.
Straw mulch?
Straw mulch?
Yeah.
Straw mulch is okay. Because it tends to be cylindrical. It doesn't tend to compact. And actually, if you're establishing a lawn, straw mulch is the best thing to put on top of the seeds in terms of keeping the seeds and everything in place as the lawn is growing. But in terms of it keeping weeds out of a landscape, it's not really very effective, because it just tends, again, at thicker layers, to compact too much. But it's really great for establishing a lawn.
Thank you. I know there's so many good questions, and also there's streamers have questions for you. Will you be here at lunch?
Oh, I'll be here. I'll be here till the end of the day.
And will you join us for the panel discussion this afternoon?
Absolutely.
All right, we'll have more on mulch at the panel discussion if you raise the questions. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
For you.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. And so I'd like to present one of these tree cookies made by George Duda, and it's from Think Trees. So here you
Thank you so much. I love it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for having me again.